It's great to be with you, and I'm going to speak about the topic that I ended up doing my license on at the Angelicum. That was 100 pages, and we're not going to have 100 pages tonight, but it's about a vice called acedia or acedia. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. Yeah, yeah, but there's a mysterious mysterious element to it, and I first came across it. I was browsing in St Paul's bookshop next to Westminster Cathedral, and doing something that I often do, which is buying more books, even though I've not finished all the books that I already have. And I came across this book, and it had the intriguing title, "The Two Faces of Laziness." And and I thought, well, what are the two faces of laziness? And I started to read this book, and I thought that's interesting and interesting enough to buy it. And then when I took the book home, I was like, oh my goodness, I need to sue this woman for trespass. She's been inside my head, and she's been recording my thoughts. And she described all these sorts of things which I'm not lazy on a visible thing. Like if you looked at my timetable and you looked at what I was doing, like you wouldn't say I was lazy, but this other form of laziness which she seemed to describe, which was sort of starting lots of stuff and then not always finishing all of it, or sort of beginning a book and getting loads out of this book, um, and then getting distracted and going and finding another book and saying this is brilliant, and not quite finishing or doing to the best of my ability any one individual thing. This started to ring true a little bit, and I started to think. I don't know if any of you know the Wind in the Willows. So you got like Mr. Toad, and he's like on the barge, and he's like, this is the best thing. And then he discovers the motor car, and he's like, boop boop, and he's like, this is the best thing. You know, I'm gonna love this. And then he discovers the sort of plane. It's always this thing is gonna be the great thing, and then he gets sort of restless and dissatisfied. And what I started to discover that what seemed to me in some ways this very modern phenomenon of this sort of restlessness or this sort of apathy and nothing ever quite completely satisfying. What seemed to be so very modern, and I think it is very modern, was also very, very old. And that's because human nature doesn't really change. The circumstances in which we live our human nature with our brokenness and also the great gifts that God has given us, those alter, but profoundly human nature doesn't change. And this is why I'd recommend all of you at some point to read the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, because they are some of the best psychologists of all time. And acedia is first described by a desert father called Evagrius. And Evagrius has a fascinating life. And the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, we think of them as like being way out in the desert. They weren't really, they're kind of on the edge of the floodplain. So like where the floodplain stops, that's where the desert begins. And they go out there because they want to be more intentional about living the Christian life. Like in the first 300 years of Christianity, you don't have to be that intentional about being intentional. When people are trying to persecute you, when they're trying to arrest you, you know, intentionality takes care of itself. But once things start to get a little bit comfortable, and we can recognize that in the circumstances of our life, we can sort of start to go through the motions. But what the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers didn't want to do was get comfortable and go through the motions. So they went out into the desert literally to face their demons. And Evagrius identifies what he calls 8 logismoi, which are sort of like 8 deadly thoughts or 8 demons, and it's from which attack us. And it's from this 8 that eventually it moves into a list of 7. We get the idea of the 7 deadly sins from. Logismoi, yeah. So Logismoi. And that both means sort of thoughts, where we get the logos from. That's the Greek philosophical word for the divine reason that's at the heart of the universe, guiding the universe. And St. John in his magnificent sort of prologue to his gospel. It's the logos, which is the word that becomes flesh. Divine reason incarnates in human flesh. But there are also, as we know, there are other spirits and other thoughts active, and these are, he describes them simultaneously as demons and as deadly thoughts. And acedia he describes as the noonday demon, by which he means it's the one that attacks you in the middle of the day. And I'm going to read to you his description of it, of Agrius. He says, the demon of acedia, also called the noonday demon, is the most oppressive of all the demons. He attacks the monk about the 4th hour, that's about 10 a.m., and besieges his soul until the 8th hour, 2 p.m. First of all, he makes it appear that the sun moves slowly or not at all, and that the day seems to be 50 hours long. Then he compels the monk to look constantly towards the windows, to jump out of the cell, to watch the sun to see how far it is from the 9th hour, to look this way and that way, lest one of the brothers might have the good idea of coming to distract him from the monotony of his cell. And I think as I first read about this, I was doing some study at the time. I was still a lawyer at the point, but I thought, this sounds like revision or essay writing in the library. He opens up his assignment, and then he checks Facebook. He types a few words, and then he remembers an email that he needs to reply to. He writes a few more words, gets a bit stuck, and then decides to check on Instagram for a while. Then he wonders whether he shouldn't have picked an easier essay title. This one's too hard, it's too difficult. Then he thinks, well, I'll just go for a walk and then maybe I'll feel more like the essay afterwards. And then Evagrius, he gives some other features of the attack of the demon of acedia. He writes, and further, the demon instills in him a dislike for the place and for his state of life itself, a dislike for manual labor, and also the idea that love has disappeared from among the brothers, and there is no one to console him. And should there be someone during those days who has offended the monk, this too the demon uses to add further to his dislike of the place. He leads him on to a desire for other places where he can easily find the wherewithal to meet his needs, to pursue a trade that is easier and more productive. And then the demon depicts for him the long course of his lifetime. Maybe you thought, you're now in a job and you're a few years into a career and you thought, gosh, really? This for the rest of my life? Or when you're at university and you're doing one of the hard subjects and you think, why didn't I pick easy subjects? But then he writes, the demon employs every device in order to have the monk leave his cell and flee the tedium. But after this, no other demon follows this one. A state of peace and ineffable joy ensues in the soul after this struggle. And so from the description of Evagrius, there are 5 principal manifestations of acedia that I'd like you to think about and to see whether these are going on in your life. The first is a certain interior instability. The second is an exaggerated concern for one's health. The third is an aversion to manual work. The fourth is neglect in observing the rule. And obviously for me, that's very obviously a rule of life. But for all of you, there will be a certain pattern of life that you're existing, or a framework within which you're asked to sort of exist at work. And there can be the constant looking for the get around, like, oh, this rule, maybe other people need this, but I don't, a resistance to that pattern. And then the fifth point he makes is just a general discouragement. And so as I was reading about this, first in this lady's description, and then when I started to read Evagrius himself, and don't feel intimidated by these writers from the 4th century. You can pick up translations of them and you can read them easily because they're so humane, and I'd encourage you to do it. But I started to think, well, what actually is acedia though? Like, what is this noonday demon, and how would you define it? And then I started to read about St. Thomas Aquinas on acedia, and he describes it as sadness over the spiritual good. And that doesn't make any sense. Why would we be sad about something that is good? And so what follows now, I'm going to try and make a little more sense of that definition, because I do think it gets to the heart of it. And what I want to do to help you do that is to help you understand the way that Aquinas conceives of what motivates us in human life. Because have you ever heard people say, like, you say, "Oh, I love pizza," and and people go, "Oh no, you shouldn't use the word love about pizza. Pizza is not something that you love. You love God or you love your neighbor." Aquinas would say, "No, no, no. Like, you can love pizza. Or pizza quite properly existed then, but he lived a fair bit of his life in Naples, so I'm sure primitive pizza was around." So for Aquinas, there is this basic dynamic of why we do things, and it's that we see something's good, and we love it, and the things that we love, we desire union with, and then when we have union with it, we experience joy or pleasure. So on a very simple level, and this he calls the passions, because they sort of happen to us. We don't have to be intentional about making it happen. So if I see a steak, I don't have to think long and hard about wanting it. It just happens to me. I see the steak, I recognize steaky goodness, and so I desire it. I want union with it, and the union that you get, good form of union you're going to have at a steak, is the union of it in your mouth being chewed upon. And then when you're chewing it, you experience joy. So you've got that basic dynamic of love, loving the good thing, desiring the good thing, in union with the good thing, and experiencing joy. But like conversely, say little Johnny sees a Brussels sprout, and he knows Brussels sprouts are evil. And so he sees the evil thing and he hates it. And because he hates it, rather than union with it, he has an aversion. Now Mummy's bringing it on the end of a fork, and little Johnny is like, he doesn't want it, got an aversion. And then when it gets shoved in his face, hopefully in his mouth, but when it gets shoved in his face, then he is in union with the evil thing, and he experiences sadness. And this is the basic dynamic that's going on in our life constantly. And it's good that we don't have to think about these things, because if we had to consider every single decision of our life, we'd be paralyzed. So there are these basic passions which keep us alive. We don't have to think too hard about sort of eating. We don't have to think too hard about trying to get away from dangerous things. We just simply see the dangerous or the evil thing, and we get away from it. Now he also has, these are what he calls the concupiscible passions. He also has what he calls the irascible passions, which relate to how we deal with the good thing insofar as it's difficult to get. Like, so going up the mountain and wanting to see the great view, but it being difficult to go up the mountain. You know, like on mountains you can injure yourself, can't you? Or there's a bad thing which is hard to avoid. I'm not going to go into details on those things, but basically the way that our bodily passions work for the sort of physical things, that also maps quite well onto how we experience it in the spiritual life. And so if all were sort of working well, when we saw God and we thought of the things of God, we would recognize the goodness of God, and we would then desire union with God, and then we would have that prayer or we receive the Eucharist, we would experience the joy. But all of us, if we're honest, that at certain points in our life, the joy that should be there isn't really there. And Aquinas says that Jadia is like sadness over the spiritual good of charity. And charity, he gives this rather beautiful definition of. He says that Charity is friendship with God. Could we possibly be sad about friendship with God? That doesn't make sense. It's the greatest sort of friendship in the world. Why on earth would we have that? And there's a lady called Rebecca Condyte de Jong who has written extensively on the vices in fineness, and acedia is a vice. And she describes it, and I think she gets the heart of it when she says it's resistance to the demands of loving. That friendship with God, the things of God, have a cost. And we don't always like that cost. And so we experience the cost, the demands of loving as something that's evil, and it causes us sadness. And why would that be? And why do I think that acedia has become an even bigger problem in the present age than it was perhaps at the time of Evagrius? And what I started to see in really good writers is that they describe what I've sort of called a certain cultural acedia. And I want to quote from you from a couple of those writers now. That's one. He's one of my favorite writers, David Foster Wallace. I quote him all the time. And in his novel, massive novel called Infinite Jest, which is about an entertainment cartridge, I think equivalent of a video DVD or something, that is so entertaining that it causes the viewer to fall into a sort of an infinite coma. But he speaks about the general attitude towards these different cartridges. One of his characters says, the moment he recognized what exactly was on one cartridge, he had a strong, anxious feeling that there was something more entertaining on another cartridge, and that he was potentially missing it. And then Jonathan Franzen, another favorite writer, in his novel Freedom, he describes this wife called Patty, whose marriage is sort of difficult. Says, what she should have done then was find a job or go back to school or become a volunteer. But there always seemed to be something in the way. There was the possibility that her son would relent and move back home for his senior year. There was the house and garden she'd neglected in her year of drunkenness and depression. There was her cherished freedom to go up to the lake house for weeks at a time whenever she felt like it. There was a more general freedom that she could see was killing her, but she was nonetheless unable to let go of it. And then one final Foster Wallace quote, he says, in The Pale King, which is a novel he set in a tax office, because he was very interested with the idea of boredom. That boredom characterizes an awful lot of human life, and how do we deal with it? And he says, this character says, I didn't stand for anything. If I wanted to matter, even just to myself, I would have to be less free by deciding to choose in some kind of way. And I think we're resistant to the idea that in choosing to love someone wholeheartedly, there is a sacrifice. There are other things that must be given up. In choosing to enter into religious life, I could spend all my time resenting the fact that I can't get married and have children, or I can focus on the beautiful things, the opportunities that religious life opens up to me. But I think in so many ways we get so caught up with what we're sacrificing, or what God is calling us to sacrifice, that we fail to recognize what the sacrifice is for, or the good thing that we're being offered. And why I think that's particularly hard in today's age is that there's a few characteristics of modern life. The first one is around the internet, that it is based on a philosophy of distraction. The internet is not monetized by you staying and enduring in one thing for a long period of time. It is monetized by you clicking through from one site to another, from one advert to another, or by you clicking and buying one thing after another. The internet does not want you to rest. And yet God calls us to rest with him. That's what prayer is in a certain way. Before it's anything else, I think it's a resting with God. There's another thing about online life, is that tends to work pretty smoothly. Like say the only thing worse than no internet is slow internet. But in the main, like virtual life is very smooth. You click in it and it happens. But in the real world, there's resistance and there's difficulty. And the more and more of our lives that we're spending online, the smoother we expect life to become. And then that actually sort of tees us up very, very badly for living in the friction of embodied life. But embodied life is what we're called to live in. Our embodied life is beautiful and it's good, and Christ has made it extra special by the fact that the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And the body is the sacrament of the human person. The body is by means that the person, which in some ways is hidden. My interior life is revealed through my body to the other person. It's the way that I engage with the world, and it's through my body that I love. But there are difficulties with my body. There's the finitude that we feel. There's the tiredness that we feel. There's the I can't do everything that I want to do. I can't remember all that I want to do. And then there's also the other thing that the internet tends to be just about me, about the satisfaction of my desire. But when I enter into the real world of loving and dealing with another person and their desires as well, and sometimes my desires and their desires come up against one another, and I have to sacrifice what I want for the sake of what this person. I think those are a few of the things, and there's a lot more, but I think I'm coming towards the end of my time, that we can see about why this very old sort of demon of acedia, it has to be even more battled. And I want to leave you just with a couple of thoughts about attention, because attention and that interior instability that Evagrius speaks about. Well, attention is by sustaining our attention on one thing is the way that we gain stability. And one time, I tell this story quite often. I was in a park in Rome, near the priory where I lived. I don't know if you know the Chalian Hill in Rome. Bless you. And it was just up from San Clemente where I lived, and there was a man who was walking his dog, and he was also on the phone, and he had a tennis ball in his hand. And obviously, because he's Italian, whilst he's talking, he's gesticulating wildly. And the dog is seeing the tennis ball, and it's like, oh, and it constantly thinks it's gonna be thrown. And this conversation is going on and on, and the whole time, and the dog can't give it up. And I'm sitting there on the park bench, and I'm in hysterics. But I'm also thinking, poor dog, like he can't choose to just ignore it or to give his attention to something else. But we as human beings, we can choose what we give our attention to. That is one of our most profoundly human qualities, that we can be intentional about our attention. And so there's a film, Lady Bird, which I like a great deal, and in that sort of Christine, who goes by the nickname of Lady Bird, she meets with the sister who is the headmistress of the school. And she's written a project about Sacramento, and all in the film, like Lady Bird has a difficult relationship with her mother, and also like a difficult relationship with Sacramento, and she can't wait to leave it. And Sister Sarah Jones says to her, like, it seems that you really love Sacramento. And Lady Bird says, like, I do. And she goes, well, the way that you write about it, it appears that you love it so much. And Lady Bird says, well, I guess I just pay attention. And then Sister Sarah Jones says to her, well, it comes across as love. Don't you think that loving and paying attention might be the same thing? And I think they are. And I think if we look at what we give our attention to, what we really intentionally give our attention to, we'll find out about what we love. And I'll just leave you two quotes from a writer called Simone Weil, who is an amazing woman, Jewish mystic who came to know Christ. And she says that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And then she also writes that attention between lovers has a transformative quality. So I just ask you, maybe in this time of prayer now, and then more generally at some point this weekend, to take a little bit of time and to think, what do I give my attention to, and to realize that before your money, before any talents, before any other things that you might give, that your attention is precious, and that it matters. And then to be truly intentional about giving your attention to the things that are worthy of you, and to endure sometimes in the boredom of prayer. Foster Wallace, he describes boredom. He says that we experience a certain sort of psychic pain. And sometimes remaining in prayer is painful, sometimes because of the memories, but also sometimes just because it's boring. But I can't imagine the cross was that entertaining. We're called to endure and to remain